Good morning, Library Land. My name is Dr. Karlos L. Marshall, and I serve as the Director of Community Impact and Innovation here at the Dayton Metro Library. Today marks the start of Season 2 of Cataloging the Culture, where we bring Black men that are working in and across and with libraries across the country to share their unique journeys and experiences to help us improve and further our library profession. Today, I'm joined by Lajmar Anderson from Sinclair Community College. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for being here. Lajmar Anderson is currently a Reference and Instruction Librarian at Sinclair Community College, where he serves as the liaison for the Division of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. In this role, he works to educate students on the nuances of information, literacy, and research. Lajmar has worked professionally in academic libraries for 20 years and as an academic librarian for the past 16 years. Lajmar is a graduate of Indiana University, where he earned his Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Master's of Library Science, and is currently working on a Master of Arts in Political Science. So let's kick this off and start to catalog your journey. Just tell us a little bit about your upbringing, in the childhood into adulthood. You talked about just growing up in Richmond, Indiana. So how was that experience for you?
So growing up in Richmond in the 80s, I'm an elder millennial. I'm the Zennial generation, or geriatric millennials, as some of the younger millennials like to call us. It was interesting. So, growing up at that time, Black, biracial, in an intermixed household, very different, I think, than now. Like, there weren't a whole lot of examples of how that worked. My mom's stepfather was Black. My father is Black. We just had a very intermingled household. And at that time, it was, very different. But there's also still some similarities to today. I was very strange as a child. I'd like to say I'm probably still very strange as an adult. I was very immersed into reading. I loved reading. One of the number one questions people always ask me when they find out I'm a librarian is, oh, you must love to read, which is true, but that doesn't really have a lot to do with my job currently. Yeah. So anyways, long story short, heavy into books, heavy into reading. And I would frequent my public library quite a lot. I spent a lot of time there. At that period, it was not unusual. I was like 6, 7, walking to the public library by myself. I don't think that would be as common today as it was in the 80s. Absolutely. But I was, the librarians all knew me. So I would spend a lot of time at the library. A lot of my formative years were there. There was a period, so my stepfather was in the Air Force. And so we lived in California for a year and Arizona for 3 years. So did leave the area for a little bit, and then came back to Richmond. So I was gone through all of those awkward middle school years and then came back for high school. So that was an interesting experience. But through that traveling, like, libraries were kind of my go-to for security, for being seen, for like finding out about the world and finding out about myself, because they were kind of a staple everywhere I went. It was always really kind of interesting because it was very, very rare that I saw any librarians of color, regardless of where I was. I did not officially meet a Black librarian until I, in high school, started working at my public library. So that's actually kind of funny, too, is I've really just kind of always been in libraries. So I started at 14 working at the public library in town. There was a Black librarian who worked in cataloging. And it's funny, when we were talking about doing this interview, of like going back in my brain, just trying to remember things. And some things, are always really, really clear and others aren't. But she was the first time I'd encountered a Black librarian, but she was working behind the scenes. So we didn't really interact a whole lot, but it was just kind of like this, like, okay, so there's folks here. Like, this is actually a viable path, potentially, was kind of planted in my mind. And I worked in that public library up until, I can't remember if it was my first or second year of undergrad. And then I kind of made forays into the world of retail, But then I ended up, as I was finishing up undergrad, back in an academic library. So I started working as the Access Services Evening Supervisor at Ball State University. And so that was a staff position. Eventually, I moved up as I started my MLS program into to be a supervisor of their archives and special collections.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And representation absolutely matters. Sometimes seeing is believing.
Yeah.
Talk to us more about, you started working at your local public library in high school. Like, how did that process work? Did a librarian always send you there and offered you a job, or did you just inquire about a potential opening?
So they had student positions open, and sometimes libraries still do. I don't know how popular of a job it is these days, but they had student positions open at that time. There were some that were for shelving up in the circulation area. I actually ended up being in the audio-visual department, and so I was doing shelving and things at first. As I got to my final year of high school, I actually graduated early, and so I was able to take on a adult part-time position there, and so I started doing that. So I was working with more circulation-related duties and things like that as well. In that role, I was mostly supervised by staff, but there was a librarian that was over the AV department at that time. So there was constant interaction with the librarians, but it was not as close as it would be like when I moved into my later roles at academic libraries.
For sure. And when you were the nighttime supervisor, that was during your undergraduate?
That was the last 2 years of my undergrad. So I started that job. I had moved to Muncie. The person I was seeing at the time had lived there, was working there too. So relocated, for romantic reasons, as we sometimes do. And so I started there, and I think that was really when it kind of clicked in my head, because libraries had stayed with me through all of this, but it really kind of clicked in my head, like academic librarianship was something I was really strongly interested in. So, and there I did have a couple solid librarians who were mentors. But.
Okay. Talk to us more about the solid librarian mentors that you had in that process, and then how that influence you to then pursue your MLS degree?
So I'd finished my bachelor's in psychology, and I've always been really kind of interested in people and how they think, but also really how we consume information, and that's just kind of grown. I've really this kind of fixation on like how we consume information, what we do with it, how we're processing it, what we're thinking about it. So at one point I thought I really wanted to go down this kind of psychology rabbit hole. But as I was working in libraries, as I was observing the librarians doing the more academic level research, the type of support that they were providing, seeing that they weren't just like, here's this book, like they were actually teaching as they were doing. A friend of mine who I consider a friend now, who was a mentor then, she had completed her MLS. And as she was completing it, she saw my work, she saw what I was doing, and she just kept encouraging me. She's like, you should pursue this program. She's like, you would be great at it. She's like, we need more men in this program. She's like, we need more people of color in this program. She's like, you need to pursue this. And, I had wrapped up my undergrad, and undergrad took me, I put it out there, undergrad took me a bit. I consistently went, but, sometimes I only took like 2 classes at a time. I went to a commuter school. And so, having her encouragement was really helpful, because at that point in time, I had achieved the highest level of education, both sides of my family. And I think still currently I do have the highest level. Don't quote me on that. Family sees this. Don't get mad at me if I'm wrong. Just correct me, but I'm pretty sure I do.
Right. Absolutely. And I want to continue to kind of turn the page as you really immerse yourself within the profession very, very early, which I found just being in the profession now 5 years, having worked in both nonprofit sector, worked at UD for almost a decade before coming to the Dayton Metro Library. But I think for most people, even that hold the MILS degree, that they kind of stumble upon the profession.
Yeah.
Whether they were a teacher, went in the classroom, didn't like it or something, but you are kind of rare in that sense that you were pretty immersed in it, even as a teenager. So talk to us more about some of the other jobs that you had leading up to, landing yourself here at, Sinclair Community College.
So as I mentioned, I had staff positions at Ball State Libraries. So I did the access services evening coordinator position for, I think it was like 2 years. And then I shifted as I started my MLS program. There was a position that was open in the archives and special collections. And I always had kind of an interest in history. I would sometimes go down these kind of rabbit holes with very like niche subjects. So, I saw the position. It was an upgrade as far as jobs went. I had just finished my bachelor's. So I applied and I ended up getting the position. And so I spent 2 years in the archives while I was, it was actually ended up being 4 years in the archives. So let me back up with that. So the 2 years were while I was completing my MLS. And then there were the 2 years of job hunting after the MLS for a professional position, which is a whole other story. So I worked in the archives, and it was actually a really good role for me as I was getting myself prepared to be an academic librarian, because we dealt primarily with graduate students. We had professors coming in. We had researchers who were researching books, folks with their PhDs who would come in and research, because there's a really rich history in Muncie, Indiana. A lot of history around, there was a lot of resistance to the Klan in Muncie, Indiana. There was the Muncie Post-Democrat, which was run by one of the mayors at the time, which could call out like Klan members that were in politics. And so like we had a lot of the archives and things related to that. We had some rare books collections. So we get a lot of researchers coming in researching those types of things. Part of that was I also got to teach graduate students about primary sources research. So I was doing basically info lit sessions while I was getting my degree, before I had my degree, which is typically stuff you don't do until you're actually out as a professional librarian. So it's kind of getting on the job training, which I found kind of made me unique amongst my peers. Because like you were saying, a lot of the people I was in school with at the time, they were people who had either they were former teachers or they were people who, again, had stumbled into the profession. There weren't very many of us who had actually been engaged in libraries at the time. There were a handful that, were working in public libraries and decided they wanted to pursue their MLS. But again, we were a rarity. So I did that. And then I finished my MLS in 2010, and after that, it was the interesting realm of navigating getting a professional position. I had all this experience and everything, but the recession had started happening around 2008, and all these people were supposed to retire, but people didn't retire. So there were some interesting challenges. I still have some peers who never entered the profession after that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And as you talk about your experience in Muncie, and, serving as a resource and guide for people conducting graduate level research as well as professional researchers with the unique history and the rare books collections and the archives and special collections, talk to us more about just how you see the functionality of a college library at Sinclair, and how that's both similar and or different to the functions and missions of a library at a 4-year university.
Really across academic libraries, there is a similarity. Now, I would say where the difference is that when you're not at a university that has like graduate level courses, you're not getting the folks coming in that are working on their dissertations. So like you're not getting that level of research. really what you're focusing on are those kind of core skills, which is also what you'll get when you are getting. So one of the things that happens in academic libraries is that typically like your basic English class will come in for some type of library session. Generally, that's just covering, here's some basic information literacy, here's some basic digital fluency. Here's how we evaluate information. Here's how we think critically about the information we're consuming, those types of things. So that's kind of standard across the board. Once you start to work with graduate students, which in a later job, so I did spend 2 years at the for-profit Walden, where I was primarily working with doctoral students, very different. Because with them, you're working a lot with helping them navigate their dissertations, how to set up the research for that, how to, set up alerts for new research that's coming out, how to figure out, well, how many times has this been cited? What are some of the more complicated forms of searching that you're not necessarily going to do with somebody who's, just in the undergraduate sphere. So there are differences, there are similarities, because even at those advanced levels, you often have to revisit some of those core skills. So I would just say one is providing the foundation. The other one is when you start to get into, here's the more advanced nuances of this realm of information literacy and research.
Absolutely. Tell us more about your specific role being a reference and instruction librarian, and specifically how you support the academic division that you're within. I know that you also mentioned that you teach classes and everything like that. So what is kind of your day-to-day or your weekly schedule look like?
So the classes are typically what we would call one-shots. So a class will schedule with us and they will come in, and we will have a session to teach the students how to do research and how to think about research. Other times, what you'll get is a class that will meet with you multiple times. So I have a couple that will meet with me 2 or 3 times. And sometimes within those classes, there'll be different nuances. So maybe one session is, here's how you do your basic research. Here's how you build a search. Here's how you do some Boolean operators. The next class may be all about evaluating information. And the evaluating information has become very popular the past few years. How to look at information, critically evaluate it, determine is what I'm looking at true, which becomes harder and harder every day for folks. The day-to-day can vary. And this is really at academic libraries across the board. Typically you're going to find that the fall semesters are really, really busy. Spring semesters are busy, but it's a different kind of busy because by then people have kind of acclimated if you get new students and things like that. But it's still a pretty steady time. Typically across the board at academic libraries, summers are quiet. But day to day is, it's just kind of varies. Like in my current position, I'm not just in the library. And I think that's kind of one of the things that people often think about libraries. So I mentioned earlier that people are always like, so you're a librarian, you like to read. And I do love to read. I love reading. And I think that more people should read for leisure more. I think that there's a lot of value in that. But most of my job, I don't do a whole lot with books. I do collection development. So I will get resources to support my programs. And that's pretty standard when you have a librarian who's a liaison for particular departments or programs, is they are doing the collection development for that. And that tends to mean that we are evaluating databases, journals, and books and other media to support those programs. So that's generally when the books start to kind of come into play, unless I'm doing some kind of like one-off, like we're leading a book discussion or something, which I'll sometimes do just for fun. But in general, I'm sometimes going to other departments to support them. Sometimes I will pop up and, be in spaces just so that the students can find me, instead of them, or so that I'm there for the students so they don't have to come seek me out. Because that's one of the things that we noticed several years ago is that there are certain times, like students will not physically come to the library, but they will gather in other places. And so I'll pop up in places like that. Some of my colleagues will too, just to be there. So the day-to-day can vary a lot. Sometimes there's reference hours, sometimes there's instruction sessions, so it's never the same every day.
Absolutely. Appreciate that context, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what librarians do, and that's part of dispelling those myths and misnomers to educate people and to open the doors for new pipelines and pathways. And also as an educational point for myself as well as our listeners, does your specific library system have a tenure track process? Because I know that is rare, but I know that the University of Dayton has it. So does your system have that?
My current one doesn't. And also just to give some context for that too, because like you mentioned, it is rare. So you can be a tenured librarian in certain places. There have also been roles I've had where I've been considered faculty, but we're not teaching faculty. So it gives you the connections you need to be able to attend faculty meetings and things, which is really important when you're a liaison. Other places, librarians are considered these kind of not faculty, not staff. So this is just kind of one of the interesting things about when you're in academic librarianship, is there's not necessarily consistency in what you're considered where you go. So my current role, we're considered professional staff. Other places, you're just like, so when I was at Ball State, the librarians were considered professionals, which was different from the staff. So like, it's just kind of all across the board. And that's something really important to pay attention to, though.
For sure.
Because, if you're applying for a tenure track position, you need to know everything that entails. Like, so are you going to be expected to publish? And if you are expected to publish, are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
And other positions that are considered faculty. So like when I was a faculty, I worked at Earlham for a year. We were considered non-teaching faculty. We were not required to publish. It was not a tenured faculty position. So
definitely appreciate that context, which is important as prospective MILS students and people that want to get to the profession are, watching these various interviews and episodes. I've had a couple of people that are in academic libraries, obviously people in public libraries. So just also understanding that even if you choose this path, that there's still a multitude of entry points into the profession is really critical as well. Tell us, what's the most fulfilling aspects of your role, and also conversely, what's some of the most challenging aspects of it?
It's actually probably the same thing, but like the flip side of each. So like for me, I think when it really clicked, because so one of the things is and I think we're all guilty of this now, is we are constantly consuming information. We're not always thinking about it. And I, just like everybody else, I have my moments where I just want to zone out and like stare at the screen and just disassociate. I think we all have those moments, but you can't do it all the time. And we talk, when I do my sessions on, disinformation, and we talk about critical thinking and evaluating information, one of the things we talk about is this idea of constantly consuming information and regurgitating it, but not actually exploring it.
Yeah.
Not looking at the nuances, not comprehending. And I mean, as we know, like, we are currently experiencing a literacy crisis, which also includes comprehension. It's not just about, can you read a book? It's about comprehending information that you're taking in. So when we're having those conversations, I'm having those conversations, and the students start to be able to express back to me ways that they are examining what they're consuming and not just taking it in, that they're actually thinking deeply about it. And sometimes those clicks come after. Like sometimes I will have a student say something to me after a session, or their professor will be like, look, they really were moved by this and whatnot. When that happens and they actually are seeming to get it, or they have those kind of epiphanies in the sessions, or even I hear about it and afterwards in retrospect from a faculty member, that to me is telling me I'm doing my job. Because at the end of the day, what I want is to help make people more conscious consumers of the information they're getting. Like, yes, I can teach you how to find information. That's no problem. And that's a role that I think is important too. But I think right now it's that critical moment of, but are you a conscious consumer of what it is you're taking in? And for me, that's kind of, as a librarian, as people who our expertise is information, like, and I think that's kind of gets lost sometimes, is like, we are like information experts. Like, that is where our areas are. I think it's a critical role for us right now. And so when I get that, that's when I feel the most fulfilled these days. Now, that could shift. It could be something different in 10 years as the world shifts. And if you'd asked me a decade ago what was most fulfilling, it might have been a different answer. That's kind of the paradox of this. The flip side of that, the most challenging is sometimes the same thing, is trying to get across this understanding that there are a lot of charismatic people online that appear to be experts, that might present themselves as experts. That doesn't necessarily mean they're giving you solid, credible information. And just because you like what somebody says, and just because they kind of fall into the silo of what you already believe, doesn't mean you should always believe them. And sometimes we kind of get stuck in that. And so when I see folks that get stuck in that pattern, figuring out how to help them get out of that is probably one of the more challenging things. And that's kind of the other thing too, is that we know, like, just kind of thinking back, like circling back to this, like, representation in libraries too, because the thing I didn't mention off topic is, after that first encounter, when I was a teenager, I didn't meet another Black librarian again until I started at Sinclair. So it's a wide spectrum. So, but anyways, I also think particularly how the research shows the disinformation disproportionately impacts Black communities. And so that is something that's always kind of at the forefront of my mind as I'm working with students, is how these things are really impacting our communities too, very strongly. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for that wealth of information. I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper on a multitude of things that you just highlighted there. Just the lack of exposure in terms of encountering Black librarians within the profession, when we know is that Black men represent less than 1% of MILS degree holders. But you also talked about your upbringing and coming from a multiracial family. Public libraries, academic libraries, like every other sector, has challenges with supporting both recruiting and retaining and promoting diverse staff members. And so you talk about being a conscious consumer of information and looking at the nuances. So talk to us a little bit about just kind of how you navigate this professional arena with such a unique intersectional identity of being biracial, also identifying as a Black man, coming through the MILS ranks, but also identifying as being queer. So you're at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities. So how are you able to navigate that professional space, and then how does it shape the way that you show up and support others?
I have always found, I think part of what drew me to libraries is that they are one of the most welcoming spaces I've ever been in. And with all of those different intersections, not only were the librarians always helpful, at that point, I was a really, really early reader. Like I mentioned, I was reading well ahead of where I should have like, I got bored with the children's section, and I would start to kind of venture out and find things, but they helped me educate myself. At that point in time, like, I actually kind of envy the folks coming up now, because they have access to information, and even though there are still problems with representation, they still have so much more than we had in the 80s and the 90s, so much more visibility, which is one of the blessings of social media. I will say, like, for all the problems, there are blessings that are there. But all of those different intersections, I think that is part of, with the whole information, is what kept me attached to libraries. Is they are welcoming of regardless of who you are. And even with academic libraries, I think sometimes people think they're these kind of closed off have like spaces for an elite few, but typically what a lot of people don't know is a lot of your academic libraries have pathways for community members to come into. So they have spaces for community members to come in and use their computers or to check out their materials and things like that. So even academic libraries, I mean, you know, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but most of your state academic libraries are going to have some accessibility for the public. So seeing spaces that are so accessible to so many different groups of people, so welcoming, so eager to help you with the research, because that's one of the other things too, I think a lot of people do not realize is that a librarian's role is not to judge what it is you're interested in. Now, in the academic setting, you know, if you are doing a research paper, like I tell my students, I'm not going to judge your topic, but I am going to tell you, by academic standards, is this something that would be considered credible? Now, whether you choose to use it or not is totally up to you. Like, so typically the limitations are going to be around like, well, what are your requirements for your class? But in general, like, we're not judging what you're researching. We're not judging your personal interests. We are there to support you in getting good, solid information on whatever it is that you want. So I think as I, you know, just kind of live my life with all of these kind of different dynamics of who I am, libraries have always been really supportive of that for me. You know, they've been kind of places of refuge, and, you know, away from sometimes the crazy that can be in the world. I feel like I'm missing a part of your question.
For sure. But I mean, if you could also just talk about, for our library leaders that are watching this, you talked about libraries being a place of both welcome and refuge. What specific strategies, programs, or policies makes libraries welcoming places, and what should library leaders be trying to implement to continue to improve culture and climate, as well as to diversify the profession and make sure that we can reach the patrons that we're here to serve?
For me, I think it's remembering that you are part of a bigger community, whether you're part of an academic institution, whether you're a public library or whatnot. You know, we sometimes use the word community, but I think sometimes we forget like that is like the people right outside of our doors. And I think getting those connections, getting the people in. So one of the things, you know, I think about a lot sometimes too, think about family members and things like that is, you know, nobody ever deterred me from reading. They were really excited I was reading. But like one of the things I noticed is like other Black boys around me, I didn't hear a lot of encouragement. Go to your library, go read. And when I would go to the library at that time, like I also like didn't see a whole lot of people of color in the spaces with me. Like every now and then I would see a family, but I don't feel like it's a space that we are actively encouraged to be at a lot. Now that dynamic may have shifted, but at least when I was coming up, it wasn't really something that was actively like pushed a whole lot. And so I think making sure that we're making sure that like everyone in our communities know you are welcome. You should come use this space. We have really, really amazing resources for you. But beyond the resources, I think one of the things we have to make people aware of, because I think this kind of gets lost sometimes too, is I think we've kind of moved into this thing where we like kind of focus a lot on the resources and we forget about the people. And I know for me, yes, I remember like, my favorite book in a certain section or whatnot, but it was the librarians that made me keep going back. Yeah. And so I think making sure that people understand, like there are people here who will uplift you and who will help you educate yourself and who will answer these questions for you, particularly right now when, you know, we're just kind of, like I said, we're flooded with information all the time and we don't always know how to determine facts from fiction. You know, making sure our community knows we're here to support them, I think is a big thing.
Absolutely. Truly appreciate that. Yeah. Is there anything else that you would like to add that you haven't been able to speak on yet?
I think that, if you are passionate about information, if you are passionate about supporting your community, this is a profession that, we need more representation in. It is one where that I don't think, we're often encouraged, nobody other than when I was working in the library. Like if I hadn't been working in the library, I don't know if anybody would have encouraged me, go be a librarian.
Yeah.
It's just not a pathway that is really thought about like that. Particularly for men and particularly for Black men. Like it's just it's not something they think about us doing, which is why I'm so excited you've been doing this series, is because I do think we need more visibility. I mean, the fact that I went 40 something years, and in 40 something years, it was 2 Black librarians I met ever. As much as I go to libraries is crazy.
Yeah.
So,
right.
I mean, it's just kind of, until I moved here and then, it's just kind of, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, how can people continue to follow your work as well as connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Yes, I'm on LinkedIn as Lajmar Anderson. So,
absolutely. We'll definitely have your information on here. Thank you so much for joining this morning. Really
it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening for another episode of Cataloging the Culture, where we share one story, one page at a time, featuring Black men in libraries working across the country. Again, I'm your host, Dr. Karlos L. Marshall. Until next time, thanks for listening.